The laugh came before the words did. Sharp, bright. The kind of laugh that cuts across a crowded room and makes everyone turn their heads. Not because it's warm, but because it carries the unmistakable frequency of contempt dressed in silk. Vivian Cole didn't try to hide it. She never had. At 43, she had built 3 energy companies from concept to acquisition, graced the cover of Forbes twice, and learned early that the people who worried about hiding their reactions were the ones who weren't sure of their position. Vivian was sure. She had been sure since she was 27 years old and closed her first deal without blinking. The laugh was for the engine, or, more precisely, for the man standing beside it. He was average height, maybe 5 to 10, with the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym membership. His hands were the giveaway. Even from 20 feet away, across the polished concrete floor of the Meridian Technology Summit's exhibition hall, Vivian could see they were stained with something dark around the knuckles. Oil. Probably. Or grease. The kind that doesn't come out no matter how long you scrub. His name badge said Marcus Reed Independent Innovator. The badge was the cheap kind. A paper insert in a plastic sleeve, not the embossed acrylic ones the major exhibitors received. His shirt was a dark blue button-down that had been pressed but showed a faint crease on the left shoulder. The kind you get when you iron something in a hurry on a folding board. His shoes were clean but not new. The engine sat on a folding table, the cheap kind, the kind you rent for a backyard barbecue, covered with a moving blanket he'd folded back to expose the machine. It was about the size of a microwave oven, matte gray, assembled with a craftsmanship that was evident even to an untrained eye. Every joint was flush, every weld line was clean. But it wasn't sleek. It wasn't designed for a room like this, with its cathedral ceilings, its indirect lighting, its $60 glasses of sparkling water. Everything else on this floor was sleek. 3 startups had brought full booth installations with LED walls and motion graphics. A company out of Austin had an actual working prototype car, powered by their solid-state battery, gleaming under custom spotlights. The German firm in the corner had sent 3 engineers and a marketing director in matching charcoal suits. And then there was Marcus Reed, with his folding table and his paper badge. Is that Vivian's colleague, a pale man named Desmond who managed her West Coast portfolio, leaned close and whispered. Is that a hand-built thermal conversion unit? It's a piece of someone's garage, Vivian said, and laughed again. Though not as loudly this time, she kept walking. She had 3 meetings before noon, and a flight to consider. What she did not see, because she had already turned away, was the old man who stopped dead in his tracks 6 feet from Marcus's table. His name was Howard Finch. He was 71 years old, had spent 38 years at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory before retiring, and had 3 honorary doctorates in thermodynamics. He had a reputation in certain circles for being the person you called when your data didn't make sense. Howard Finch looked at the engine. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked at the engine again. And he went very, very still. You have to understand what a gara is in Queens when you're 8 years old and your mother has just died. It's not a garage. Not the kind people photograph for lifestyle magazines. With its pegboard tool racks, and its floor epoxy, and its mini-fridge full of craft beer. Marcus Reed's garage was a single-car structure attached to a rental house on the corner of Hillside and 194th, with a crack running the full length of the east wall and a fluorescent tube that flickered every 37 seconds Lily had counted. She told him once, very seriously, that it was exactly 37. Lily was 8 when her mother, Claire, died. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in October, gone by the following March. That was the part that undid Marcus completely. The speed of it. He'd had no time to adjust. One season, Claire was complaining that the radiator made a sound at night. The next season, she was gone. And Marcus was standing in a hospital parking garage at 4 a.m., unable to remember where he'd parked. He had been, before all of this, a mechanical engineer. Not a famous one. Not the kind who gave talks. He'd spent 6 years at an energy storage company called Altus Power in New Jersey. working on thermal regulation systems for industrial battery units. He was good at it, good enough that his supervisor had twice recommended him for the senior development track. He had declined both times because the track would mean travel, and he didn't want to travel. He wanted to be home for dinner. After Claire died, he lost the Altus job inside of 4 months. Not because they fired him, they were actually kind about it. More kind than he'd expected. He lost it because he stopped being able to do the thing that made him good. Concentrate. His mind would drift. He'd be sitting at his desk, running a simulation, and suddenly he'd be in the hospital room on that last afternoon, watching the light change on the wall. It took him about 6 minutes to come back. He lost a lot of hours that way. He left Altus. He moved back to Queens, to the rental on Hillside, because the lease was cheap and his sister Renata lived 3 blocks away and could help with Lily. He started doing mobile repair work, engines, transmissions, basic electrical out of the garage. He was good at that too. Good with his hands. Good at listening to a problem. And at night, after Lily was asleep, he started working. He told himself it was just to keep his mind busy. Something to focus on instead of the hospital room. Instead of the way the light changed. But slowly, over months, it became something else. A mission. A specific, almost obsessive mission. The thing about Claire's medical bills, the thing he didn't talk about, not to Renata, not to anyone, was that she might have had more time if they had caught it earlier. She had gone to the doctor twice with symptoms she described as fatigue and something she called deep stomach pressure. And twice she had been told it was probably stress. The second time, the doctor at the clinic, a decent man, not negligent, just overworked, stretched thin across too many patients, had ordered a follow-up scan, but noted it was non-urgent given the wait list. By the time the scan happened, the cancer had moved. The clinic was underfunded. Most of the equipment was old. Operating costs were brutal. Marcus had thought about this for a very long time. The idea that formed, slowly, in the garage on Hillside, in the space between the flickering fluorescent tube and the sound of Lily breathing through the baby monitor he still kept, even though she was 8, was this. What if you could make power generation so efficient, so affordable, that even a small rural clinic, even a community hospital with a broken budget, could have what it needed? What if the reason people died wasn't always the disease? He started sketching. Then he started building. He had to teach himself things he hadn't studied. Material science. Advanced thermodynamics. Proprietary sealing techniques. He read journal papers at midnight. He borrowed textbooks from the library and returned them weeks late because he'd annotated the margins. He ordered parts from industrial suppliers and second-hand electronics dealers and machined several components himself on a lathe he bought used from a closed auto shop in the Bronx. Lily learned to sleep on the couch in the garage. She had a fleece blanket and a stuffed elephant named Colonel Peanut, and she would curl up and watch her father work until her eyes gave out. Sometimes she would ask him questions. He always answered, no matter how tired he was. What does thermal mean, Ba? It means heat. It means using heat to do something useful instead of letting it disappear. Like a blanket? Exactly like a blanket. You're a genius. She had smiled and pulled Colonel Peanut tighter and fallen asleep. 3 months before the Meridian Summit, Lily had pressed $12, all her birthday money, into his hand. Don't quit, she said. She was very serious about it. The way children are serious when they sense that the adult is close to the edge. Don't quit, Ba. He had held the $12 for a long time after she went to bed. He did not quit. Where did you study? Howard Finch's voice was not what you'd expect from a man his age who had spent 4 decades in a laboratory. It was direct and unhurried. The voice of someone who had asked thousands of questions and knew how to wait for the real answer. Marcus looked at him. He had seen the name on the badge. He knew who Howard Finch was. He had read 3 of the man's papers. I didn't, Marcus said. Not for this. I have a BS in mechanical engineering from Rutgers. Everything else I taught myself. Howard looked at the engine again. He crouched slowly, his knees complaining audibly, and studied the seam between the primary chamber and the secondary exchange coil. This joint here, Howard said. You used a ceramic composite layer? Modified. I couldn't afford the standard industrial grade, so I developed my own compound. Took me about 8 months to get the thermal expansion coefficient right. Howard stood. He was quiet for almost a full minute. In a room full of noise, the murmur of hundreds of conversations, the hum of demonstration equipment, the distant sound of a presenter's microphone, Howard's silence was its own kind of sound. What's your claimed efficiency rate? He said finally. Measured, not claimed. 91.4% thermal to electrical conversion under sustained load. Howard Finch blinked once. That's not possible, he said. But the way he said it wasn't dismissive. It was the way a scientist says that can't be right when they're already trying to figure out how it could be. I have 14 months of test data, Marcus said. In triplicate. I built 3 identical units in sequence to verify replication. The third one is the one you're looking at. It performs within 0.1% of the other 2. Howard was quiet again. Then, who have you talked to? About this, I sent letters to 4 companies. 2 didn't respond. 1 sent back a form letter. 1 told me to contact their IP acquisition department, and when I did, they stopped responding. You sent letters. I don't have contacts. I'm a repair guy from Queens. Howard turned and looked at the room, at the booths, the investors, the circling money in tailored clothing, and then turned back. I need you to understand something, he said quietly. What you've built, if your data is correct, and I'm going to need to spend time with that, data represents a potential disruption to every energy storage and generation paradigm currently operating at industrial scale. The people in this room who understand what this means will have one of 2 reactions. They'll want to own it, or they'll want to bury it. Marcus didn't look surprised. I know. Good. Then you understand why I'm going to ask you to be very careful about who you speak to today, and what you agree to. Howard straightened his jacket. He was about to say something else, when a voice cut through the ambient noise of the hall, confident, carrying, with the professional warmth of someone who had learned to project authority. Dr. Finch, I didn't realize you were attending this year. Vivian Cole had come back. She hadn't come back for the engine. She'd come back because she'd spotted Howard, whom she knew professionally, and had changed direction. But her eyes landed immediately on the machine on the folding table, and then on Marcus, and something shifted slightly in her expression, not softness exactly, but recalibration. Howard looked at her evenly. Miss Cole, have you had a chance to look at Mr. Reed's work? I glanced, Vivian said. I'd recommend a longer look, Howard said, which for Howard Finch, who measured words like reagents, was essentially a thunderclap. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She looked at Marcus. He looked back at her, not hostile, not eager to please. Just level. Walk me through it, she said. Vivian Cole had not survived in a brutal industry by being incurious. Whatever else you said about her, and plenty of people had plenty to say, she was not someone who stayed ignorant because intelligence threatened her position. She had built her reputation on being the person in the room who understood the technology better than the technologists. So when Howard Finch, a man whose professional opinion had, on 3 separate occasions, saved her from making catastrophically wrong investments, said, "Take a longer look." She took a longer look. Marcus explained the engine without performance. He spoke the way someone speaks when they've explained something many times to themselves, in the dark, and have finally figured out the precise words. He talked about the phase change material in the secondary chamber, the modified thermal coating on the primary exchange surface, the way the ceramic composite junction solved a heat sink problem that had limited every comparable design he'd studied. He talked about the replication tests. He pulled up data on a battered laptop. Vivian listened. She did not ask easy questions. She asked the hard ones, the ones that were meant to find the seams in a story, the places where confidence was actually vacancy. Marcus had answers for all of them. Not always simple answers. Sometimes he said, "I don't know yet," and then explained exactly what he knew and what he was still investigating, which was more credible than certainty would have been. 30 minutes in, Vivian excused herself and made a phone call. She did not make it where Marcus could hear her. When she came back, her expression was different. Not humbled. Vivian Cole did not do humble as a facial expression, but recalibrated. The way a thermostat recalibrates when the ambient temperature changes by something it wasn't prepared for. I looked you up, she said, sitting down across from him at the folding table. While I was on the phone, okay, you worked at Altus Power. You have 2 U.S. patents and 1 pending, all filed before you left. Altus let the patents lapse. They decided not to pursue commercialization. The patents expired, and I retained rights. You retained the rights and then built this. Over 4 years. Yes. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Around them, the hall hummed on. A group of European investors walked past, speaking quietly in German. I was rude to you this morning, she said. Marcus met her eyes. You laughed at me. Yes. She didn't soften it or add qualifiers. I did. Another pause. The Japanese consortium in Bay 7, she said. They've already put a number in the air. Informally. Did someone pass it to you? 5 million. That's not what this is worth. I know that, Marcus said. That's why I'm still sitting here. Something moved across Vivian's face that might, in different lighting, in a different context, have been respect. What do you want for it? She said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. And then he said the most surprising thing anyone had said to Vivian Cole in a very long time. That depends on what you plan to do with it. Word travels fast in a room full of people whose entire profession is identifying value before anyone else does. Howard Finch had not made an announcement. He had simply, in the course of 3 conversations over 90 minutes, mentioned to 3 specific individuals, a former DOE, senior analyst, a partner at an infrastructure fund, and a veteran energy journalist, that there was something on the floor they should look at. Howard was not prone to understatement. The message was received precisely as intended. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Marcus Reed's folding table had attracted a quiet orbit of people who were not browsing. They were assessing. The Japanese consortium Takamura Energy technically came back at 3. Their representative was a polished man named Christopher Walsh, an American who had worked for Takamura for 11 years and wore his suits with a precision that suggested strong opinions about fabric. He sat across from Marcus and put a revised number on the table without preamble. $8 million. Cash acquisition, full IP transfer, 2-year consulting contract. Marcus looked at the number. He thought about Lily. He thought about $12 pressed into his palm. He thought about the clinic where the scan had been marked non-urgent. I need more time, he said. Walsh kept his expression professional. We'd like to move before the close of the summit. I understand, Marcus said. I still need more time. Walsh withdrew. He did not withdraw far. Vivian had been watching from a distance. When Walsh left, she crossed the floor. You didn't take 8 million, she said. No. Why? Marcus looked at her. Because I've thought about what happens when a technology like this gets bought by a company that needs to protect its existing revenue streams. It gets licensed selectively, or it gets shelved, or it gets used in a way that doesn't reach the people who actually need it. You think that's what Takamura would do? I think that's what any company with a fiduciary obligation to shareholders has to consider. It's not malice. It's structure. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what if the acquisition was structured differently? How differently? What if instead of a clean IP transfer, you retained partial ownership and had contractual approval rights over licensing decisions? Marcus studied her face. That's not the standard model. No, she agreed. It isn't. Before he could respond, a figure appeared at his elbow, a heavy-set man with a thick accent and an expensive watch, who identified himself as a representative of an American energy infrastructure company. He did not sit down. He named a number while standing. 15 million. The quiet orbit around the table shifted. Another conversation happened. Marcus barely caught it between 2 men in dark suits on the opposite side of the hall. One of them picked up a phone. At 4:17 p.m., a number entered the room that was not whispered. It was said at full volume, in a carrying voice. by the chief acquisitions officer of a company that extracted and refined petroleum in 4 continents, who had been standing at the back of the orbit for 45 minutes and had apparently reached the end of his patience. 22 million. Cash. 1 week to close. The murmur that went around the room was audible. Marcus sat very still. Vivian put her hand briefly on the edge of the folding table, not touching him, just grounding herself, and said, very quietly, "This is only the beginning." She was right. By 5:30, the informal bids had reached 31 million. By 6, the energy journalist Howard had spoken with was already filing a story. By 7, 3 more parties had entered the orbit. The summit's organizers, realizing something extraordinary was happening on their floor, had quietly called in a moderator. At 7:43 p.m., the oil and gas representative, a man named Gerald Ashby, who wore his certainty-like armor, stood up from his chair and said a number with the finality of someone who does not expect to be outbid. $50 million. The room went completely silent. Not the polite silence of people paying attention. The involuntary silence of people who have been stopped mid-breath. Marcus looked at the folding table. At his hands. At the engine. Under the light. He thought about the garage on Hillside. The flickering tube. Lily counting the seconds between flickers. 37. He looked up at Vivian. And then, in a voice that carried clearly across the silent room, he said, "No." Gerald Ashby blinked. It was the first time in a long meeting that his expression had changed from controlled authority into something more basic. Something almost lost. "I'm sorry," he said. "No," Marcus said again. "Thank you." But no, the silence held for another 3 seconds. Then, the room erupted. Not in anger, though there was some of that, particularly from Ashby, who was a man unaccustomed to being declined. It erupted in something more like shock. The sound of people recalibrating, people who had spent decades in rooms where everything had a price, confronted suddenly with someone who was behaving as though the price was not the point. Vivian was watching him. Her expression, for the first time all day, was fully unguarded. Howard Finch, standing to one side, permitted himself the smallest possible smile. Marcus waited for the noise to settle. He had something to say, and he was going to say it only once. "I want to explain why," he said, when the room had quieted enough to hear him. His voice was steady, not performative. He was not making a speech, he was stating facts. "The person I built this for can't be in a room like this. She's been gone for 4 years. Her name was Claire, and she died from a cancer that was found too late because the clinic she went to didn't have the equipment to move faster. The equipment costs money. The operating costs of a clinic like that are brutal. Power is a big part of those costs." He paused. The room was very quiet. "I built this to make power cheaper. Not cheaper for people who are already fine. Cheaper for the places that are not fine. A rural hospital in Mississippi. A community clinic in the middle of nowhere in Montana. A pediatric ward in a city where the budget has been cut every year for a decade. If I sell this to a company that buries it or licenses it at a price those places can't afford, I've accomplished nothing. I've just become a number on a balance sheet." He looked at Gerald Ashby. He was not unkind about it. "I don't think you're a bad person," Marcus said. "I think you're a person with obligations I can't work within. That's not a judgment. It's just a mismatch." Ashby was quiet for a moment. Then, to his credit, he sat down. Vivian stood up. She stood at the edge of the table, and the room, which had been watching her all day because it always watched her. She was the kind of person rooms watched, gave her its full attention. "I want to propose something different," she said. Her voice was the same as it always was. Controlled, clear, carrying. But there was something underneath it today that wasn't usually there. Something her assistant, Camille, would later tell a colleague she had never heard from Vivian in 11 years of working for her. Not an acquisition. A structure. A governance model where the technology is licensed through an independent foundation, where Marcus retains a meaningful ownership stake and a seat on the foundation's board, and where community medical facilities, below a defined revenue threshold, receive access at zero cost. The commercial applications, industrial, residential, utility, generate the revenue that sustains the foundation and funds continued research. She paused. I've been drafting terms in my head since about 4 o'clock. I can have a legal framework in 72 hours. Another pause. I'd also like to offer a personal commitment of $20 million as the founding endowment. The room was not silent this time. The room broke into something that, in a different context, in a different century, would have been called a commotion. Marcus looked at Vivian for a long time. Why? He said. She held his gaze. Because about 2 hours ago, I remembered something I used to know. Before I forgot it, she told him later, not in the exhibition hall, but in a quiet corner of the summit's adjacent conference room, after the legal teams had been called, and the moderator had formally adjourned the session, and the journalists had filed their stories, and the building had gone from frenetic to exhausted. She was 43. Her father had been a pipe fitter in Cleveland. He had worked for the same company for 28 years and been laid off 6 months before his pension vested. In a move so calculated, it had been used as a case study in a business school class she had later attended. She had watched her father come home on a Thursday afternoon, in the middle of the workday, carrying his tools in a plastic bin. She was 12. She had been doing homework at the kitchen table. He had set the bin on the floor and sat down at the table and put his face in his hands. He had not cried. He was not a man who cried. He had just sat there, and she had sat across from him and not moved, because she understood instinctively that moving would break something. Eventually, he had looked up. His eyes were dry. "We'll be okay," he said. "We'll figure it out." They had figured it out. It had taken years, and it had been genuinely hard, and her mother had worked double shifts at the hospital admissions desk for 3 of those years. But they had figured it out. Vivian had figured out other things since then. How to be the most capable person in a room. How to never give anyone the leverage of her vulnerability. How to look at a man with grease on his hands and a paper name badge and see, automatically, status rather than substance. "I forgot what it felt like," she said. "To be the person everyone in the room has already decided doesn't belong." She wasn't looking at Marcus when she said it. She was looking at the middle distance, at something internal. "I built my whole career on never feeling like that again. And somewhere in building it, I became the person who does it to other people." Marcus was quiet. "I laughed at you this morning," she said. "Not at your engine. At you. At the presumption of you. A man in a wrinkled shirt with a homemade machine in a room full of people who had resources you didn't have." She shook her head slowly. "And then Howard looked at it, and I looked at it, and I listened to you explain it, and I understood that you had done something that none of the people in this room with their resources had done." Marcus waited. "You had cared enough," Vivian said. "That's the rarest thing. Not intelligence, not even genius. The caring enough. Most people with your ability find a way to get comfortable. You didn't. You stayed in the garage." The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the building, someone was rolling a cart with a squeaky wheel. "My daughter's name is Lily," Marcus said finally. "She's 8. She has her mother's eyes. Every time I look at her, I think, this is why. That's it. That's all I've got." Vivian nodded once. "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough." The next morning, a gray November morning, the city wet and cold. The summit entering its final day, Marcus asked for an hour with the legal team Vivian had assembled. He had spent the night in the mid-range hotel near the convention center, in a room with a heating unit that made a percussive sound every 20 minutes. He had not slept much. He had called Lily at 9 o'clock, Eastern Time, and she had told him at length about a disagreement she was having with her best friend, about the correct pronunciation of a word in their spelling workbook. He had given his full attention to this problem. It had been, genuinely, the best hour of his day. In the morning, he called Renata and asked her to tell Lily he'd be home by Sunday. Then he went to meet the lawyers. What he asked for surprised them. Lawyers who work for people with Vivian Cole's resources develop a certain expectation about counterparties in a negotiation. They expect either aggression or capitulation. And they are equipped for both. Marcus Reed gave them neither. He asked for three things. The first: every pediatric medical facility in the United States with an annual operating budget below $15 million would receive licensing access to the technology at no cost, in perpetuity, not for 5 years, not until the foundation's financial model changed. Permanently, locked into the founding charter by language that could not be amended by any party without unanimous board consent. The second: the Foundation's board would include 2 permanent seats reserved for representatives of community health organizations to be selected by an independent panel with no financial ties to any commercial partner. These seats would carry full voting rights equal to any other board member. The third, and this was the one that made the lawyers look at each other, he asked that the technology's development records, lab notebooks, test data, and research methodology be donated in full to the public domain within 10 years of commercialization, so that any future innovator in any country could build on the foundation without licensing restriction. Vivian, who was sitting in the back of the room and had not been expected to attend but had arrived anyway, said nothing through the first condition. She said nothing through the second. When Marcus stated the third, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Agreed." Her lead attorney turned to look at her. "Miss Cole, the public domain provision would substantially limit long-term." "Agreed," she said again. And that was the end of that conversation. Marcus looked at her across the conference table. "There's one more thing," he said. "It's personal. Say it. My daughter, Lily. I want her credited as a co-developer in all official documentation and commercial filings for this technology. Not symbolic credit. Legal, formal co-developer status." He paused. "She's the reason I finished it. Without her, there is no engine." That's not sentiment. That's fact. The room was very still. One of the lawyers opened his mouth. Vivian raised one finger, and the lawyer's mouth closed. "That will be in the founding documents," Vivian said. Her full name: Lily Reed, co-developer. Effective from today. Somewhere in a school in Queens, a girl named Lily Reed was sitting in a third-grade classroom, learning about weather patterns, with no idea that her name was being written into something permanent. Her father, 400 miles away, looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up, and his eyes were bright. The room, which had been behaving as rooms do in legal settings, formal, careful, transactional, exhaled. Even lawyers, it turns out, know when something real has happened. The formal announcement was made at the summit's closing session, which had not been on the original agenda. The moderator had added it at Vivian's request, and word had circulated through the convention center with the particular velocity of information that people sense, without being told, is worth stopping for. By the time Marcus and Vivian walked onto the small stage in the main hall, the room was full. Not full in the way rooms are full when people are obligated to be somewhere. Full in the way rooms are full when something is happening that people will tell stories about. Howard Finch was in the third row, sitting with the particular stillness of a man who is experiencing a form of professional satisfaction that most people don't get to feel in their careers. The announcement was made. The structure was explained. The foundation's mandate was read aloud by Marcus, from a single index card, in the same steady voice he'd used the day before. The terms regarding pediatric medical facilities. The public domain timeline. Lily Reed's name in the founding documents. When he said Lily's name, someone in the back of the room began to applaud. Within 3 seconds, the entire room was standing. Vivian stood at the edge of the stage and watched it happen. She watched Marcus, who was clearly uncomfortable with the attention, who had not built the engine to be on a stage, who would have been just as happy to have signed the papers in a back office and driven home to Queens in the rain stand in the middle of that applause, and absorb it with the expression of a man who is still, somewhere in his nervous system, in a garage at midnight, not entirely sure the compound is going to hold. A journalist pushed to the edge of the stage and called up to Vivian. "Miss Cole, what's the biggest lesson you're walking away with today?" Vivian looked at the journalist. She looked at the room. She looked at Marcus. She had several polished answers available. Sentences she had used in interviews before, elegant and quotable, and true in a general sense. She reached for none of them. "Don't laugh at a man just because he's standing at a folding table," she said. "What's on the table is more important than the table." The journalist wrote it down. The foundation was called the Claire Reed Initiative. Marcus had asked for that too, quietly, the morning the legal documents were finalized. And Vivian had said yes before he finished the sentence. In the 18 months following the Meridian Summit, the Claire Reed Initiative entered licensing agreements with 43 commercial partners, industrial manufacturers, residential energy providers, 3 national utility companies, and generated enough revenue in the first fiscal year to fully fund its operational costs and seed a research grant program for independent engineers. The technology was deployed on a cost-free basis in 112 pediatric medical facilities across 22 states. The reduction in operating costs at those facilities, energy costs being a significant portion of overhead-freed budget that was redirected into staffing, equipment, and diagnostic capacity. At a children's hospital in rural Georgia, the savings allowed the hospital to restore an imaging unit that had been decommissioned due to cost. The unit was operational within 8 months of the Claire Reed Initiative's first licensing payment. Marcus moved into a real office. He kept the garage, not the rental on Hillside that lease had ended, and he and Lily were in a different house now, a small one with a proper yard and a room for Lily that she had painted the particular shade of green she referred to as forest but friendly. The garage was attached. He had insisted on that when they looked at houses. Lily had understood, without being told why, that this was non-negotiable. The new garage had better lighting. He had installed it himself. Howard Finch joined the Foundation's Technical Advisory Board and came to the office every Tuesday. He and Marcus had developed a friendship that operated mostly through long arguments about thermodynamic theory and short agreements about the importance of doing things correctly. Lily called him Dr. Howard and had, on one occasion, very seriously corrected his pronunciation of the word combustion. He had thanked her with equal seriousness. Vivian Cole remained a board member and principal investor. She and Marcus had developed the kind of relationship that doesn't have a clean category, not friendship in the way that word usually means, not partnership in the purely professional sense. She came to the Foundation's first anniversary event and brought, somewhat unexpectedly, a small wrapped gift for Lily. Inside was a first edition engineering handbook from 1962, with an inscription that Vivian had written herself in her precise, angular handwriting. Lily read the inscription 4 times. Then she put the book on the shelf next to Colonel Peanut and went back to her math homework. At a keynote address 8 months after the summit, a large energy conference in Chicago, where she was the headline speaker, Vivian was asked about the decision to structure the Claire Reed deal as a foundation rather than a conventional acquisition. She stood at the podium for a moment before answering. The audience was several hundred people, most of them well-dressed, most of them experienced, most of them accustomed to answers that were strategic and polished and pointed toward the future. "I almost didn't," she said. "I walked past him that morning and I laughed. I laughed at him because his shirt wasn't pressed quite right, and his machine was sitting on a folding table and I had somewhere to be." She paused. "I've made a lot of decisions in my career that I'm proud of. I've made some I'm not. That morning, that 30 seconds is the clearest example I have of a decision that came from the worst version of who I am. The version that confuses position with worth." She looked out at the audience. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd done everything right. He'd spent 4 years in a garage, alone, with a dead wife and a little girl, and an idea. And he'd built something real. The only thing that made me laugh was that he looked like someone who had started from zero, and I had forgotten that starting from zero is not a flaw. It's sometimes the only honest place to start from. She let that sit for a moment. "The best investment I've ever made is the one that cost me my certainty. Not my money, my certainty. The belief that I could look at a person and know their value in 30 seconds. She shook her head. You can't. You never could. I just had to be embarrassed in front of several hundred people to remember it. On a Saturday in early February, Marcus drove out to Queens. He didn't have any business there. Renata had moved to a different neighborhood, and his friends from the old days were scattered. But he drove to Hillside anyway, parked in front of the rental house, and looked at the garage. The new tenants had painted it. It was light gray now, with a red door. There was a child's bicycle leaning against the outside wall. Marcus sat in the car for a while. He thought about the flickering tube and the 37 seconds. He thought about $12 in his palm. He thought about Claire in the autumn, before October, when she used to complain that the radiator made a sound at night. And he would promise to fix it. And he never did, because there was always something else, and then there was no more time. He thought about the engine on the folding table, the room full of people who were sure of their position, the laugh that came before the words. He thought about what it meant that something built in this garage, this specific structure, this specific rectangle of cinder block and bad wiring, was now powering a ward in Georgia where children went to be made well. He could not calculate what that was worth. Some things don't have a price. Not because they're priceless in the sentimental sense, but because the standard unit of measurement doesn't apply. You need a different scale entirely. Marcus started the car. He drove home. In the house with the forest but friendly room, Lily was at the kitchen table doing what she had apparently been doing for some time, drawing a very detailed diagram of what appeared to be a modified engine configuration, using colored pencils, with labels in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. The labels were not entirely correct from an engineering standpoint. Several of them were entirely correct. "What's this?" he said, sitting down across from her. "An improvement," she said, without looking up. "The secondary chamber could be wider. You lose efficiency at the junction." "I've been thinking about it." Marcus looked at the diagram. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the diagram again. "Show me," he said. She looked up. Her eyes. Her mother's eyes. He thought, always, her mother's eyes were bright, with the particular focus of someone who has been thinking about a problem for a long time, and is finally being asked to explain it out loud. She picked up a fresh piece of paper. "Okay," she said. "So, the thing is about the angle." The kitchen was warm. Outside, February was doing what February does. Inside, a man who had started from zero sat across from a girl named after a flower, and they talked about heat and efficiency and what it meant to make something useful from what the world had given them. The engine in the garage at the Foundation's research center hummed at 91.4%. The one Lily was designing, if she was right about the junction angle, might do better.